Between the years 2018 and 2020, the geopolitical landscape of the world appeared to shift violently. The headlines were dominated by a single deafening narrative, the trade war. President Donald Trump imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese goods. The media ecosystem, from cable news to the front pages of the financial press, screamed about a new era of protectionism. Both the Republican and Democratic parties, usually locked in bitter gridlock, found themselves singing from the same hymn sheet. They spoke of standing up to Beijing, of reshoring American jobs, of finally correcting the imbalances of global trade. The entire political establishment of the United States seemed united in a singular declaration: we are finally going to fight back. To the average observer, to the voter in Ohio or the small business owner in Texas, it looked like a divorce. It looked like the world's two largest economies were decoupling. But while the politicians stood at podiums and delivered thunderous speeches, and while the cameras captured the drama of diplomatic standoffs, a very different reality was unfolding in the quiet, climate-controlled server rooms of Lower Manhattan. In those exact same years, 2018, 2019, and reaching a fever pitch in 2020, the titans of American finance were not decoupling. They were integrating. BlackRock, J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and the institutional heavyweights of Wall Street quietly moved $1.4 trillion into Chinese markets. Let that number sink in. Not 105 billion. Not 500 billion. $1.4 trillion. The timing is what makes this figure so arresting. The peak year for this capital injection was 2020, the absolute height of the trade war rhetoric, a year when the world was locked down and political tensions were at their breaking point. If you look at this through the lens of standard political analysis, it makes no sense. You might conclude this was a mistake. You might think Wall Street simply misread the room, or that they were caught off guard by the shifting tides of populism. You would be wrong. This was not a miscalculation. This was the most predictable, mathematically precise maneuver in modern financial history. It appears contradictory only if you believe that politics drives finance. But when you invert that relationship, when you understand that politics is often the theater that distracts from the mechanics of capital, the contradiction vanishes. We are witnessing a pattern. It is a cycle that has repeated itself for over 300 years, across empires, across continents, and across currencies. It is a pattern so reliable that once you learn to recognize its stages, the confusion of the current moment evaporates, and the trajectory of American economic power becomes terrifyingly clear. We are currently living through stage 3 of a 4-stage mechanism. The global financial system is not a chaotic environment. It is an engineered system. And like all engineered systems, it has a life cycle. This specific 4-stage mechanism has presided over the destruction of every single reserve currency in recorded modern history. To understand where we are going, we must understand the architecture of the machine. Stage 1 is the inception. Financial elites create a monopoly on money printing through the establishment of a central bank. They centralize the power to create currency. Stage 2 is their expansion. They use this monopoly to finance government ambition through debt. During this phase, everything looks magnificent. The economy booms, the empire expands, the military dominates, and the standard of living rises. It feels like a golden age. Everyone believes they have finally solved the economic riddle. Stage 3 is the overextension. The system hits its mathematical limits. The debt load becomes unserviceable without debasing the currency. The government loses control of the fiscal narrative. Cracks appear in the foundation. The currency starts to lose value slowly at first, then all at once. Stage 4 is the transfer. And this is the part that the history books often omit. The same architects who built the system, the same institutions that profited from the rise, begin to move their capital to the next rising power before the collapse is obvious to the general population. The citizenry is left holding the worthless paper of a dying empire, while the wealth of the elite has already migrated to safety. We saw this mechanism execute in the Dutch Empire. We saw it in Great Britain. We saw it in Weimar Germany. And we are watching it happen in the United States of America right now. To see the future, we must rewind to the past. We must go back to where the modern version of this machine was invented. London, 1694. England is exhausted. The country is locked in a brutal war with France, and the treasury is empty. King William III is desperate. He has no money to pay the troops, and his credit is ruined. Enter a Scottish financier named William Paterson. He approaches the crown with a revolutionary, almost alchemical idea. He proposes the creation of a private institution, the Bank of England. The deal was seductive in its simplicity. The bank would loan the government £1.2 million in gold at an 8% interest rate. But the gold was not the point. The genius of Paterson's scheme lay in the fine print. In exchange for the loan, the bank was given the right to issue notes, paper money, against that government debt. The government created debt. The bank turned that debt into money. And that money circulated through the economy as if it were gold. The wealthy subscribers who owned the bank didn't just collect interest on the initial loan. They effectively collected rent on the nation's entire money supply. Stage 1 was complete. The monopoly was established. Almost immediately, Stage 2 kicked in. With this new power to print money backed by government promises, Britain's constraints vanished. Within just 4 years, the national debt exploded from £1.2 million to £16 million. It fueled the rise of the Royal Navy. It funded the colonization of India, of Africa, of the Americas. By 1815, after financing the Napoleonic Wars through continuous money printing, the debt hit £885 million. To the average Briton, this looked like unparalleled success. The Union Jack flew over half the planet. The British pound sterling became the global reserve currency. If you wanted to buy tea in China or cotton in the American South, you paid in pounds. Foreign governments held pounds in their vaults as if it were gold itself. It was the age of Pax Britannica. But by the mid-19th century, the rot of Stage 3 had set in. The cost of maintaining a global empire began to outpace the productivity of the British economy. Industrial dominance began to shift. Germany and the United States started producing steel and machinery more efficiently than the factories of Manchester and Birmingham. The debt began to climb again, not for expansion but for maintenance. And here is where the pattern reveals its cold rationality. The financial institutions in the City of London, the descendants of the system Paterson built, saw the writing on the wall long before the politicians did. They began to move. British capital started pouring out of London and into New York. The Rothschilds and the merchant banks of London financed the American railroads. They bought American steel mills. They funded the industrialization of their own rival. By the time Britain officially abandoned the gold standard in 1931, by the time the pound collapsed as the world's reserve currency, the transfer was already complete. The architects had rebuilt the exact same system in New York. They had moved the money before the collapse. Stage 4 was executed perfectly. The British public was left with austerity and a devalued currency, while the capital that once resided in London was now busy building the American century. This is not an isolated incident. The mechanism is agnostic to nationality. It cares only about yield and preservation. Consider the second example, perhaps the most terrifying economic horror story of the 20th century, Germany after World War I. The year is 1919. The Treaty of Versailles is signed. The Allied powers, vengeful and bloodthirsty, saddled Germany with a debt of 132 billion gold marks in reparations. It was a sum that could mathematically never be repaid. The Weimar government was faced with a binary choice: impose crushing austerity and taxes on a starving population to pay foreign enemies, or turn on the printing press. They chose the press. The Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, began monetizing government debt on an industrial scale. They printed money to pay striking workers. They printed money to fund social programs. They printed money to keep the fragile political coalition from tearing itself apart. When France and Belgium invaded the Ruhr industrial region in January 1923 to seize coal in lieu of payment, the German government's response was an act of economic suicide. They ordered the workers in the Ruhr to strike, a policy of passive resistance. But these workers still needed to eat. So the government paid millions of people to sit at home and produce nothing, using money that was created out of thin air. The supply of paper marks went vertical. It defies human comprehension. In May 1923, the money supply was 8.6 billion marks. By August, it was 669 billion. By November, 400 quintillion. The stories of this period are well known, but they bear repeating because they illustrate the speed of the collapse. A wheelbarrow of cash could not buy a newspaper. Workers were paid twice a day and given hour-long breaks to rush to the shops, because by the time their shift ended in the evening, the wages they earned in the morning would be worthless. Prices rose while customers stood in line. The German middle class, the doctors, the professors, the engineers who had saved their entire lives, saw their savings evaporate in a matter of hours. But here is the part they do not teach you in high school history class. This was not merely an accident of incompetence. Rudolf Havenstein, the president of the Reichsbank, was not a fool. As the currency collapsed, he deliberately engaged in the sale of marks for foreign currency at any price. British and French advisors at the time noted that this looked like deliberate currency destruction. And in retrospect it was. The hyperinflation served a dark utility. It wiped the slate clean. It eliminated the domestic war debt entirely. It destroyed the politically inconvenient power of the middle class. And when the fire had burned itself out, when the currency was reset in November 1923 with the Rentenmark, the stage was set for the next phase of the transfer. The solution to the German crisis was the Dawes Plan of 1924. This plan brought Wall Street directly into the heart of Europe. American banks led by J.P. Morgan flooded Germany with loans to restructure the economy. American corporations bought up German assets at fire sale prices. The cycle repeated. The collapse of the German currency opened the door for foreign capital to restructure the system, extract the value, and position itself for the next phase. When the German system collapsed again in the early 1930s, paving the way for the rise of National Socialism, the international financial interests had already hedged their bets. The pattern is consistent. A central bank monetizes debt. The system expands through inflation. The currency is debased to keep the illusion of prosperity alive. And finally, foreign capital or the domestic elite restructure their holdings, exiting the dying currency and moving into the assets of the rising power. This brings us to the third example, the one that created the world we live in today, Bretton Woods. In 1944, as the smoke of World War II was still clearing, representatives from 44 nations gathered at a hotel in New Hampshire to design the new financial operating system of the planet. The United States, holding 2/3 of the world's gold and its only intact industrial base, dictated the terms. The US dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Every other currency on earth was pegged to the dollar. It was a pyramid with gold at the base, the dollar in the middle, and the world economy on top. The dollar was as good as gold because foreign central banks could, in theory, redeem their green paper rectangles for solid bullion at the U.S. Treasury. For 20 years it worked. The dollar lubricated global trade. Europe rebuilt. Japan rose from the ashes. The American middle class enjoyed the greatest expansion of wealth in human history. But the temptation of the printing press is irresistible. By the mid-1960s, the United States began to cheat. The administration of Lyndon B. Johnson wanted to fight a war in Vietnam and build a great society at home. They wanted guns and butter. But they didn't want to raise taxes to pay for it. So they used the exorbitant privilege of the reserve currency. The Federal Reserve expanded the money supply. They kept interest rates artificially low. Dollars flooded the world. America ran larger and larger trade deficits, exporting inflation to its allies. By 1971, the math was broken. There were far more paper dollars circulating in foreign vaults than there was gold in Fort Knox to back them. The ratio was upside down. The French were the first to call the bluff. President Charles de Gaulle, seeing the debasement of the dollar, famously denounced the American exorbitant privilege. He ordered the French Navy to sail a battleship to New York Harbor to physically collect the French gold reserves. He wanted metal, not promises. The run on the bank had begun. On August 9th, Switzerland left the system. On August 11th, the British ambassador asked for $3 billion of British reserves to be converted into gold. Paul Volcker, who was then at the Treasury, later admitted that the moment the British asked for their gold, the game was over. The United States had less than 10,000 metric tons of gold left. If they honored the British request, the vault would be empty. On the evening of Sunday, August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon interrupted the popular show Bonanza to address the nation. With a somber face, he announced that he was temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. He told the American people this was to protect the dollar from international speculators. It was a lie. It was a default. The gold window closed. That temporary measure is still in effect today, over 50 years later. The Bretton Woods system was dead. The dollar became a pure fiat currency, backed by nothing but the faith of the government and the violence of the U.S. military. Since that day in 1971, the dollar has lost over 98% of its purchasing power relative to gold. In 1971, an ounce of gold cost $35. Today it costs nearly $3,000. This was the end of the previous cycle. But it was the beginning of the current one. The system did not disappear, it mutated. And now, 50 years later, the debt has piled up again. The cracks are showing again. And the capital is moving again. But to understand the inevitability of what is happening today between New York and Beijing, we must look at how the previous masters of the universe managed their own decline. We must examine the moment the British Empire realized the mathematics were no longer on their side. By the mid-19th century, the cracks in the Pax Britannica were already visible to those who knew where to look. To the common man, London was still the center of the world. The map was painted pink with British territories. The Royal Navy ruled the waves. But in the ledger books of the City of London, a different story was being written. British industrial dominance had peaked. The factories of Manchester and Birmingham, once the unrivaled engines of the world, were growing old. Their efficiency was declining. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a young, hungry, resource-rich nation was rising. The United States and a newly unified Germany were beginning to outproduce the British homeland. The cost of maintaining a global empire is astronomical. It requires garrisons in remote deserts, fleets patrolling distant oceans, and a bureaucracy that spans time zones. By the late 1800s, this cost was growing faster than the British economy could sustain. The debt began to climb again. The pound sterling, the bedrock of global trade, was being stretched thin. And this is where the pattern reveals its cold, unsentimental nature. The financial institutions that had built the British Empire, the merchant banks, the family dynasties like the Rothschilds, did not double down on a dying horse. They did not let patriotism blind them to profit. They saw the shift in momentum and they acted. Decades before the British public realized their empire was fading, British capital began a massive exodus. It poured out of London and into the United States. It was British money that built the American railroads. It was British gold that financed American steel mills. It was the capital of the fading empire that funded the industrialization of its successor. By the time the crisis officially arrived, by the time Britain was forced to abandon the gold standard in 1931 and the pound collapsed as the global reserve currency, the transfer was already history. The architects had already rebuilt the exact same financial system in New York City. They had moved the money before the collapse was obvious to the masses. Stage 4 was executed with surgical precision. The British population was left with austerity, a devalued currency, and the fading memories of glory. The elite were already comfortably positioned in the new center of the world. This is the lesson: capital has no flag. It has no loyalty. It flows like water to wherever the yield is highest, and the safety is guaranteed. But if the British example is one of slow decline, the second example is a study in rapid, violent destruction. It brings us to the Weimar Republic of Germany in the wake of World War I. This is perhaps the most terrifying economic horror story of the 20th century, not just because of the hyperinflation, but because of the intentionality behind it. The year is 1919. The Treaty of Versailles has just been signed. The Allied powers, led by a vengeful France, impose a debt sentence on Germany, 132 billion gold marks in reparations. It was a sum that was mathematically impossible to repay. The German economy was shattered, its workforce depleted, its industry crippled. The Weimar government faced a binary choice, the same choice every indebted government eventually faces. Option A: impose crushing austerity, raise taxes to 90%, and starve the population to pay foreign creditors. Option B: print the money. They chose the printing press. The Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, began to monetize the debt. At first, it seemed like a necessary survival tactic. They printed money to pay the wages of striking workers. They printed money to fund social welfare programs to keep the fragile peace. They printed money to buy political stability. But money printing is a drug. The more you use, the less effective it becomes, and the more you need to achieve the same high. The breaking point arrived in January 1923. Frustrated by missed payments, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, to seize coal and steel by force. The German government, unable to fight militarily, ordered a policy of passive resistance. They told the workers to strike. But striking workers still need to eat. So the government committed the ultimate economic sin. They paid millions of workers to stay home and produce nothing, using money created out of thin air. The supply of paper marks went vertical. The numbers from this period defy human comprehension. In May 1923, the money supply was 8.6 billion marks. By August, it was 669 billion. By November, 400 quintillion. We have all seen the photographs. Children building forts out of bundles of cash, women burning banknotes in the stove because it was cheaper than buying firewood. But the reality on the ground was far more sinister. A wheelbarrow of cash could not buy a newspaper. Workers demanded to be paid twice a day. They would receive their wages at lunch and immediately run to the shops, because by dinner time the price of bread would have doubled. The middle class, the doctors, the professors, the engineers, the people who had saved responsibly all their lives, were wiped out in weeks. Their life savings, which once could have bought a house, could now barely purchase a cup of coffee. The social fabric of Germany disintegrated. But here is the part that is often omitted from the history books. This was not merely an accident of incompetence. Rudolf Havenstein, the president of the Reichsbank, was a sophisticated banker. He was not a fool. Yet as the currency collapsed, he deliberately engaged in the sale of marks for foreign currency at any price. British and French advisors on the ground noted with horror that the German central bank seemed to be accelerating the crash. Why? Because the hyperinflation served a dark utility. It wiped the slate clean. It eliminated the domestic war debt entirely. Inflation acts as a default on internal debt. It destroyed the political power of the middle class, making the population dependent on the state. And when the fire had burned itself out, when the currency was finally reset in November 1923 with the introduction of the Rentenmark, the vultures circled. The solution to the German crisis was the Dawes Plan of 1924. This plan brought Wall Street directly into the wreckage. American banks led by J.P. Morgan flooded Germany with loans to restructure the economy. American corporations bought up German assets for pennies on the dollar. The cycle repeated. The collapse of the currency cleared the way for foreign capital to enter, restructure, and own the system. The American financial elite positioned themselves to profit from the German recovery, just as the British had positioned themselves in America a century prior. This brings us to the third example, the one that built the modern world and the one that is currently unraveling. 1944. Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. As the Second World War ground to a halt, representatives from 44 nations gathered to design the new financial operating system of the planet. The United States, standing as the only major power with its infrastructure intact and holding 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, dictated the terms. The new system was simple. The US dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Every other currency on earth would be pegged to the dollar. The dollar became the as good as gold standard. Central banks around the world could hold dollars in their vaults, confident that at any moment, they could present those green rectangles to the U.S. Treasury and receive solid gold bars in return. For 2 decades, this system worked. It provided the stability needed for Europe and Japan to rebuild. It facilitated the greatest expansion of global trade in human history. The American middle class boomed. The dollar was king. But power corrupts, and absolute monetary power corrupts absolutely. By the mid-1960s, the United States began to abuse its privilege. The administration of Lyndon B. Johnson wanted to fight a costly war in Vietnam. They also wanted to build a massive welfare state at home, the Great Society. They wanted guns and butter. But they did not want to raise taxes to pay for it. So they did what empires always do in stage 2. They printed the difference. The Federal Reserve expanded the money supply. They kept interest rates artificially low. Dollars flooded out of the United States and into the reserves of foreign central banks. America ran larger and larger trade deficits. By 1971, the mathematics of the system were fundamentally broken. There were 4 times as many paper dollars circulating in the world as there was gold in Fort Knox to back them. The world began to notice. The French, led by President Charles de Gaulle, were the first to call the bluff. De Gaulle famously denounced the exorbitant privilege of the US dollar. He ordered the French Navy to sail a battleship to New York Harbor to physically collect the gold that belonged to France. He wanted the metal, not the promise. The run on the bank had begun. On August 9, 1971, Switzerland left the system. On August 11, the British ambassador approached the U.S. Treasury with a request to convert $3 billion of British reserves into gold. Paul Volcker, who was then Under-Secretary of the Treasury, later admitted that this was the moment they knew it was over. If the United States honored the British request, the vaults would be empty. The empire was insolvent. On the evening of Sunday, August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon interrupted the popular television show Bonanza to address the nation. He looked into the camera, his face grave, and announced that he was temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. He claimed it was to protect the American dollar from international speculators. It was a lie. It was a default. The gold window closed. That temporary measure is still in effect today, more than 50 years later. The Bretton Woods system was dead. In that moment, the US dollar became a pure fiat currency, backed by nothing but government decree and the threat of military force. Since that day in 1971, the dollar has lost over 98% of its purchasing power relative to gold. In 1971, an ounce of gold cost $35. Today it costs nearly $3,000. This was the end of the previous cycle. But it was the beginning of the current one. The system did not disappear, it mutated. The debt-based model was unleashed from the constraints of reality. And now, 50 years later, the debt has piled up again. The cracks are showing again. The same overextension that destroyed the pound, the same monetary debasement that destroyed the mark, and the same mathematical impossibility that destroyed Bretton Woods is back. And just like in 1880s London, just like in 1920s Berlin, the capital is moving again. So now let us fast forward to the present moment. Let us apply this historical lens, this 300-year-old pattern of empire and entropy, to the headlines that have dominated your screens for the last few years. If you were watching the news between 2018 and 2020, you were told a very specific story. The narrative was loud, it was combative, and it was emotionally satisfying. It was the story of the trade war. On July 6, 2018, the United States officially fired the first shot. President Donald Trump imposed tariffs on $34 billion worth of Chinese goods. The rhetoric was explosive. For the first time in decades, Washington appeared to be standing up to Beijing. The headlines screamed about a clash of civilizations. We were told that America was finally going to rebalance the scales, that manufacturing was coming home, and that the era of blind cooperation with China was over. This sentiment wasn't just coming from the White House. It was the one issue that united a fractured political establishment. Democrats and Republicans who could agree on nothing else nodded in unison, we must get tough on China. To the public it looked like a divorce. It looked like the world's two superpowers were tearing apart their economic integration. But if you turned off the television and looked at the bond markets, if you ignored the politicians and watched the bankers, you saw something entirely different. You saw a deception of monumental proportions. Because July 6, 2018, the start of the tariffs, is significant for another reason. It is exactly 1 month and 5 days after June 1, 2018. Why does June 1st matter? Because that was the day MSCI, Morgan Stanley Capital International, officially began including Chinese A-shares in its emerging markets index. Now that sounds boring. It sounds like technical financial jargon that belongs in the back pages of the Wall Street Journal. But you need to understand what this actually means. MSCI is the gatekeeper of global capital. They control the indices that the world's largest investment funds track. When MSCI decides to add a country to its index, it is not a suggestion. It is a mandate. Trillions of dollars in global capital are passive. They are managed by algorithms and mandates that simply buy whatever is in the index. Pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, university endowments, insurance companies, the 401k of a teacher in Wisconsin or a firefighter in California. This money flows automatically. So when MSCI flipped that switch on June 1, 2018, they opened a fire hose. They mandated that institutional capital from the West must flow into the Chinese domestic stock market. The timing is not a coincidence. It is the mechanism in action. While the politicians were on stage shouting about tariffs and protectionism, the financial plumbing was being rewired to pump American capital directly into Beijing. China's weight in the MSCI Emerging Markets Index went from essentially 0 to 43% by October 2020. And the result? In those exact same years, 2018, 2019, and 2020, while the trade war was at its absolute hottest, while the rhetoric was at its most hostile, Wall Street quietly moved $1.4 trillion into Chinese markets. Let me repeat that because the cognitive dissonance is essential to understanding stage 4. Not 100 billion. Not 500 billion. $1.4 trillion. The peak year for these inflows was 2020. The year of the pandemic. The year the borders closed. The year relations hit rock bottom. That was the year the financial integration accelerated the fastest. BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, didn't pull back. They expanded. They aggressively built out their Chinese operations. JP Morgan received approval for the first fully foreign-owned securities business in China. Goldman Sachs increased its stake in its Chinese joint ventures. Now you might ask yourself, why? Why would American institutions pour the wealth of the American people into the markets of America's primary rival during a trade war? If you believe the political narrative, this looks like treason. It looks like a mistake. Maybe Wall Street got caught off guard. Maybe they misread the room. Wrong. This was the most predictable move in modern financial history. It is the exact same move the British banks made in the late 19th century when they funded American railroads. It is the exact same move the American banks made in the 1920s when they funded the reconstruction of Germany. Capital does not care about your flag. It does not care about your national anthem. It cares about the life cycle of the system. And the masters of capital know exactly where we are in the cycle. We are in the terminal phase of stage 3, transitioning rapidly into stage 4. Let's check the boxes of the pattern. Stage 1, monopoly on money creation. Check. The Federal Reserve was established in 1913. Stage 2, expansion through debt. Check. The U.S. dollar financed the post-war global order, the military-industrial complex, and the welfare state. Stage 3, system overextension and currency debasement. Look at the numbers. The U.S. national debt is over $36 trillion. The debt-to-GDP ratio is at 98%, levels not seen since World War II. But unlike World War II, this debt wasn't incurred to defeat fascism. It was incurred to keep the lights on. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet was under $1 trillion in 2008. Today, after the crises of 2008 and 2020, it sits above $7 trillion. They printed more money in 2 years than the country created in its first 2 centuries. This is the mechanism of collapse. When a monetary system is based on debt, and the interest on that debt begins to consume the entire tax revenue of the nation, the only option left is to print the difference. The entity that creates the money, the Fed, becomes trapped by the entity that spends it, the government. The currency debases. The purchasing power evaporates. And the smart money, the money that understands history, knows that you do not hold the paper of a dying empire. You use that paper to buy real assets in the rising power before the music stops. That is why Wall Street is in China. The trade war was theater. It was designed to fail. Or more precisely, it was designed to provide a political cover story while the financial transfer took place. You cannot fight China with tariffs, while your largest financial institutions are effectively funding China's industrial and technological rise. You cannot decouple, while the index providers are mathematically increasing the weighting of Chinese assets in global portfolios. The contradiction is not an accident. The contradiction is the smoke that hides the fire. The British population in 1880 did not understand that their savings were building the American industrial base that would eventually eclipse them. The German population in 1929 did not understand that American loans were the only thing holding their economy together, and that when those loans were called in, their society would collapse. And the American population today does not understand that while they argue about red versus blue, while they fight over cultural issues and tweets, the foundational wealth of the nation is being transferred across the Pacific. The pattern does not care if you believe in American exceptionalism. It does not care about modern monetary theory or the belief that this time is different. This time is not different. The math is the same. The hubris is the same. And the outcome will be the same. So what do you do with this information? First, you must accept that the machine is already in motion. You cannot vote your way out of a 300-year-old macroeconomic cycle. By the time the reality of this transfer becomes obvious to the mainstream news anchors, the repositioning will be complete. The gates will be closed. You must understand that holding your wealth entirely in a currency that is being debased to service unpayable debt is a choice. It is a choice to participate in the transfer of wealth away from you. You must realize that the inflation you are seeing at the grocery store and the gas pump is not transitory. It is not merely the result of supply chains. It is the thermodynamic heat generated by a currency entering its final stage of efficiency. It is the sound of the system burning down the furniture to keep the house warm for one more winter. When the financial elites tell you not to worry, when they tell you that the dollar is strong and the system is resilient, remember that these are the successors of the men who told the British public the sun would never set on the empire, even as they wired their gold to New York. They are either ignorant of the pattern or they are complicit in its execution. The next 5 to 10 years will not look like the last 30. The mechanism is accelerating. The debt cannot be repaid mathematically. It can only be defaulted on or inflated away. History tells us they will choose inflation. They will choose to destroy the currency to save the institutions. And as the dollar loses its hegemony, as the petrodollar system frays, as the world moves toward a multipolar financial order, the capital that has already moved to the east will be waiting. This is not a prediction. This is pattern recognition. The same mechanism that moved the center of the world from Amsterdam to London. The same mechanism that moved it from London to New York. It is now moving it from New York to the next center of gravity. Wall Street has already decided. The $1.4 trillion has already moved. The integration is deeper than the headlines suggest. And the pattern, which has destroyed every reserve currency in history, is 3/4 of the way through its execution. If you want to understand what happens next, you cannot look at what the politicians say. You must look at where the money goes. If you want to know how the final stage of this pattern completes, if you want to see how the transition from American to Chinese financial dominance finalizes, you need to understand the nuts and bolts of the machine. You need to see the institutional architecture that makes this transfer possible, hidden in plain sight behind complex derivatives and index weightings. You need to recognize that every historical parallel points to the same outcome. The population is left holding the currency as it approaches zero, while the architects of the system have already moved their wealth to the next power center. That is the pattern. That is the mechanism. And that is what is happening right now in real time, while the world is distracted by the noise. Subscribe now if you want to see how the machine was built, how it operates in practice, and what the completion of Stage 4 looks like when it finally arrives at your doorstep. Because it is arriving. And unlike every time before in history, this time you have the opportunity to see the pattern while it is still executing, rather than understanding it only after the collapse is complete. The story of the American economy is not ending, it is changing. The question is whether you will be a victim of that change, or an observer who prepared for it.